Hello and welcome to Williams Mullen's Trending Now, an IP podcast, a legal podcast focused on providing innovative companies and investors with important and timely information concerning intangible assets such as patents, trademarks, copyrights, and trade secrets. I'm your host, Craig Mytelka, and today I'm going to be joined by my colleague, Ed White, who is also a partner in the IP section here at Williams Mullen, to discuss maintaining and monetizing your IP portfolio through leveraging your existing brand. Ed, how are you today? Thanks for joining us.
Craig, I'm doing great, and thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to discussing these topics, especially as we come out of this pandemic.
Yeah, I think that it's important for all companies to sort of take stock of where they are in their business planning. And, the pandemic was a problem for people, obviously, and is a serious issue. But I think it also provides certain opportunity for businesses to go ahead and perhaps expand their brand identity and expand opportunities to grow their business, to grow their market share, and just to be able to go ahead and provide an opportunity to overall look at their portfolio and see where they can perhaps tighten things up and possibly acquire additional assets. As we come out of the pandemic, it is a good time to look at your existing portfolio for a number of reasons. The primary factor, Ed, that I think that is important is that if you're tighter on cash, you have a long history of various assets that may be of benefit to you that you haven't used in a while. So I think the concept is to maybe, kick the dust off of some of this and see if it's a way to quickly acquire additional content or assets that may be valuable to your company that wouldn't require a significant output of additional funds to be able to utilize in your business planning. The main things to remember are that it can help you acquire additional talent, particularly if you're in a service-oriented business. Some of these marketing materials may be a good way to acquire additional persons that may be of value to your business that perhaps aren't happy with their current situation, or coming out of the pandemic, their situation has changed, so they may be available and looking for additional opportunities. So by dusting off what you've already done, it helps further define your business, and perhaps in further defining the business may make itself attractive to new and additional talent. I think that the key really to going ahead and looking at your existing portfolio is really to think about benchmarking what it is you're trying to achieve. Take stock in where you are and where you want to go, and almost have a roadmap of what it is you're trying to achieve so that you can better define your analysis of looking at your prior branding, your prior IP portfolio, and what kind of metrics you want to have in place to figure out how to most efficiently analyze these various materials to see what makes the most sense. A lot of this stuff, Ed, that we're talking about here, as you understand, are sort of what we call in the can. And so they're materials that probably don't need a whole lot of revamping. They're things that you've already established, you've already used. You could have actually a fair amount of advertising and branding surrounding these things. And it can be everything from earlier brochures and print media that you've had to various iterations of your website, plus television advertising, magazine advertising. Just depends how you've previously advertised your business. But the key metrics that we're looking at here is that it shouldn't require any new or much of an influx of new capital to create and launch your branding campaign. And, there's various other attributes of this that I think are important. It may strike a chord with consumers, given previous goodwill that you've established under a earlier branding campaign. And consumers may have already familiarity with it, and it will renew that familiarity with it. And so there are just a lot of benefits to doing so by using very little capital and time in order to bring something new into the market to help freshen up your business. And so, you're actually freshening it up with what you've used in the past. But of course, that's an inexpensive way to get there. I think that the key in doing so is that you need, when reviewing your earlier materials, you need to pay particular attention to whatever contracts and other kinds of agreements you had in the creation of that older branding. And it can be things like contracts with marketing firms, contracts with advertising firms, and other kinds of agreements you have in place to ensure that the ownership of this stuff is set, that you're not going ahead and expanding your use beyond which whatever license you have if you don't happen to own it. And so I think, there are a few things you want to consider when you go ahead and look at rebranding and reuse of older materials. And so, Ed, with that concept in place, why don't you go ahead and drill down further into the breakdown of what's needed for these kinds of activities and maybe take us through the various considerations that people would like to consider?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. I'm happy to do that. And I think you've hit on some really solid points there for clients and companies who are looking to try to, increase their investment in prior advertising that they've done in the past. As you said, to the extent it's in the can, why not dust it off and start using it? One thing when we talk about, the underlying the brand and underlying the advertising, we always want to be concerned, of course, about the underlying assets. And in this case, I'm really talking about the trademark registrations that a client may have. The pandemic has been an especially interesting challenge because, as you know, trademark rights come from your use of a mark in commerce and your continued use of that mark in commerce. And so, unfortunately, due to some of the pandemic quarantines and shutdowns we've had, there have been a number of businesses that have closed, typically by government mandate. So it kind of begs the question then, if you haven't used a trademark in some time, is it susceptible to a claim of abandonment? And, are you able to successfully argue that it's excusable non-use that has caused the non-use of the mark during the pandemic? Typically, when we look at trademark registrations, they're a unique IP asset in that they can be maintained in perpetuity, so long as renewal declarations are filed at the appropriate times. Typically, that's between the 5th and 6th year following registration, then at the 10th year, and then every 10 years thereafter. Interestingly enough, if you cannot assert that you are continuing to use and have continued to use a mark in commerce, then you may be susceptible to cancellation of the registration. Now, ordinarily, when you're telling the PTO, the Patent and Trademark Office, that you have not been using a mark for some period of time and it's excusable non-use, that's based on something that's beyond the trademark owner's control. So you would think that a pandemic or a government mandate to shut down would certainly fit that bill. I will say that there are a number of registrations now that are just now in the last couple of months starting to go through this. And what you're seeing is that there are registrants out there who are explaining to the Patent and Trademark Office that they haven't been able to use their mark due to a shutdown. And the Patent and Trademark Office is asking for additional information on why that is. So we'll see how some of that plays out. But I certainly would hope that the excusable non-use would certainly come into play and be appropriate when we're talking about quarantine shutdowns. I think another thing that you need to think about with regard to your assets is, are there trademark registrations that are worth maintaining? Or should you retire them to save, on portfolio management costs? And this kind of plays into what I was saying. If you are going to have to make additional efforts for example, to explain excusable non-use in a response to an office action, or to have to pay additional fees to file your renewal declarations in a grace period, well, then you may want to consider whether or not that registration is worthwhile having. And this is something you can do as you look at, holistically at your portfolio, as you were saying earlier. When you're looking at older branding, is it worthwhile rolling that out? It may be. Likewise, is it worthwhile maintaining some of the marks that you may never use? So those are things to think about as you're looking for opportunities and you're assessing your older brands. Another point I would probably make on this is that to the extent that you own domain names, are they also worth retaining or having, and given the maintenance costs involved in maintaining the domain names? and the potential for UDRP or anti-cyber squatting claims that may come out of the woodwork from third parties. As most of our listeners will know, it's not incredibly expensive to maintain a domain name, but there are things that come up with domain names like an anti-cyber squatting claim, which may lead to a UDRP, Uniform Dispute Resolution Policy proceeding, which will raise the cost of maintaining a domain name that perhaps you don't need at the end of the day. Now, if you choose to abandon a trademark registration or a domain name, before you do that, you may want to think about whether or not you can monetize them. And specifically, I'm talking about the sale of these domain names or trademarks to third parties. It's very clear to me that over the course of this pandemic, there have been some companies which are certainly in financial distress. And it's important to note whether or not those companies would be willing to sell their trademarks. Or likewise, if you're that company in distress, whether you would be willing to sell the trademark to have an influx of cash to continue to run your company post-pandemic. And the last point I'll make on sort of assessing your older brand is really in the copyright realm. As you said earlier, you're going to look at contracts, you're going to review those. You should also be reviewing your copyrighted materials, making sure that they are still available for use, potentially registration, et cetera, as you dust off those old marketing opportunities. I think this is a good segue into the next thing I just want to touch on, which is, again, during this time, there may be an opportunity for you to expand your brand portfolio. We talked about distressed companies. Certainly, I can tell you that in the restaurant industry and hospitality industry, there have been a number of brands that have been hit particularly hard. And I had an instance where a client was able to obtain a trademark registration, associated trademark rights for a mark that's not currently being used, and is now going to be able to open a franchise line of restaurants under that name. It's a name the client particularly liked, but knew that it was really not available given this essentially one or two branch restaurant up in the New York area. And so that's been a successful thing for both parties because the restaurateur in New York is going to be able to move on with a new business concept when the shutdowns lift, and our client is going to be able to move forward with a name they really love in a franchise environment. I think one other thing you might want to consider as you're looking for opportunities to expand your brand portfolio is whether or not there are new markets that you may develop that have been essentially abandoned by existing competitors. One way to do this is to research who's out there, what are they doing, are they going to move forward post-pandemic, and if they're not in this area that you're interested in, sort of like the example with our client, by all means you should pursue that. And then finally, I'll just say that as you're looking to expand your brand or expand your marketing, don't forget about the opportunity to use SEO or search engine optimization. For those on the podcast who don't know what that is, essentially SEO is a way in which you optimize your website so that users of your website or searching users on internet sites or search engines like Google will find your site more easily. It's a relatively easy thing to do if you have good technological people behind it. And it's an easy way to drive traffic to your website, especially in times when people are increasingly doing their purchasing online through websites since they're essentially at home. So that's my last point. I think actually it's a pretty good segue, Craig, into the point you're going to talk about next, which is seeking opportunities to relaunch your business and brands with media advertisement buys. So let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ed. The one thing I would add is we recently had a client that was selling one of its business units. And in connection with that business had gone through various marketing directors over the year. And they found out that they were paying for and were still owning hundreds of domain names that went back, 15 years that were no longer active. And so it was a good opportunity not only to clear up their books, but figure out what they had, what they could potentially monetize with others. And as you mentioned, because of the distress in a lot of businesses, there's opportunity out there to acquire this stuff as well, and sometimes pretty cheaply. So I think that was a point well made. The last point that I would like to talk about a little bit is, when you're looking to relaunch your business and brands, it's probably a great opportunity to talk about media buying. And as you know, media buying can be relatively expensive, but now is a great time to go ahead and look into whether perhaps you can get such good discounts that it pays to go ahead and either go deeper into media purchases or maybe, touch the water and try it out for the first time. First of all, don't let anybody tell you everything is negotiable. So you don't know unless you ask. So you really want to go ahead and take that opportunity to go ahead and look and see what kind of bang for the buck you can get. And because everything is relative to supply and demand, right now, a lot of media outlets are hungry for new business. And so it may be an opportunity to get things at a greatly discounted rate. So you want to try to optimize your spending and negotiate your fees as best you can for, not only television advertising, but print media advertising, companies that specialize in web development and brand campaigns and so forth. It's a good opportunity to assess those relationships and those opportunities and make sure that you are optimizing what it is you want to do. I think it goes back to what I originally said. You really want to have a plan in place to figure out what it is you're trying to achieve, and then make sure that you're not taking a scattershot approach, but having a methodical sort of plan in place to do key advertising and media placement that you think is going to generate and drive business to what you're trying to achieve. A great example of that is we had another client that recently found out that they could acquire studio time for doing 15-second spots for television at a significantly reduced a dollar point rather, because essentially there was a lot less people coming through the studios and doing advertising over the last year. And so these companies were sort of eager to attract new business. And so they were able to go ahead and get a extended buy on studio time that was at a a huge discount compared to where they had been. And so I think for people that have been contemplating, television, other types of media, magazine, newspaper, whatever it is, any kinds of new media on the internet and targeted through Twitter and so forth, Facebook and so on, there is a real opportunity right now to go ahead and look at those kinds of media buys and make sure that you have a plan in place, understand what it's going to cost you, and be aggressive in your negotiating of the fees to get the best rates you possibly can. And so with that, Ed, I think that gives people a little bit of a food for thought, if you would, and looking at your branding, considering your older portfolios, looking in terms of both what you currently use and don't use, and what you might not want to use in the future and could sell to others, plus what you can acquire from others, not to mention just dusting off the older materials that you have and reusing them again for your own purposes. Ed?
Yeah, Craig, that was a great summary, and I think the time really is now for our clients. There'll be a window here, as you made with the example with the advertising studio, where there'll be an increasing desire for demand, and if you can get in and use some of these things in a way where you're not financially impacting your company, by all means, they should do it. So I think you've made some great points today. Well, that will wrap up our discussion on maintaining, expanding, and monetizing your portfolio. I'd like to thank Craig Mytelka for joining me on Trending Now, an IP podcast. If you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, please contact us. You can visit our intellectual property practice page at williamsmullen.com/IP. There you can find out more about our team, as well as past episodes of this podcast and legal alerts. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified when our next episode posts. Thanks for listening, and until next time, this is Craig Mytelka and Ed White.